everybody, and welcome back to Writing the Rapids, the show where I, Joe Bielecki, talk to writers about writing. Very often those writers have been recommended to me by writers who have previously been on the show. In the case of Frog/Paris Green, she was recommended to me by Never Angeline North, Mika, and Jackie S. Paris Green is a figment of the imagination of a non-binary trans person named Frog K. If you're cold, she's cold, and you should let her in. Before we get into the conversation, let's talk about how you can support the show. If you'd like to support the show on a monthly recurring basis, patreon.com/noisemakerjoe is the place to go to check that out. If you'd like to drop me a one-time donation, paypal.me/noisemakerjoe is the place for that. If you'd like to help me as a writer out, you can buy my novel. It's called Tired, and you can find it on Amazon. And if you'd like to help the show in a non-financial way, go ahead and give the show a follow and or a rating at whatever podcatcher you find the show at. Now, without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Frog. Okay, so just before we started rolling, I complimented you on the new collection, Fuck Shit, and you mentioned that it is unrepresentative of your work to an extent, and I think that's where we need to begin, because people who are familiar with your work might want to know, and people who are unfamiliar, who are going to go for the newest thing, might be thrown off. So let's start there.
Absolutely. I think in general, like, I've been writing stuff, posting stuff online basically that I write for the last couple of years. And a lot of it, like, there was a long period of trying to determine what I could write and get away with posting online, because I'd write stuff that I just felt like this is too dark and weird. And gradually, as I became less afraid of my own shadow in that way, I found myself, including more risque or kind of explosively weird and kind of like internally off-putting pieces and like different things I posted online. And never having gotten any pushback on it, I wound up like writing a bunch of stuff, like having a bunch of stuff like that I just had never put up anywhere. And I figured, I could just put all this together and put something out based on that. My previous stuff is like structurally somewhat similar. Like, they tend to be like flash pieces. Like, I don't tend to write particularly long, but I'd say in terms of moods it treats, like the raw raunchiness, the sexuality behind a lot of it is like more subdued. And I wouldn't call that so much a difference in like who I am as a person, more just a difference in like what I was choosing to write about at the time.
Yeah, because it starts out with, well, I suppose it starts out with Pretty Pictures of Hell, but Bait really stuck out to me as an early sort of scene, structured like a play, and
I had so much fun with that one.
I can tell, with like the actor direction, lots of, Alex smugly,
yeah,
Brandon amused, Alex flustered sort of thing.
I love it. I love doing it. And like, it honestly made me kind of hungry to do more like chamber play kind of stuff.
I've been coming across that a lot more, I guess really since the start of my digging, like since the start of the show, because after I interviewed Mike Klein, who's like the third episode, he sent me his 17 pilot fish, and Mike Correo did Smut Maker, and then also Cephalonegativity, these sort of like impossible play type things. But this one is actually possible. Bait is like something that you could see performed.
Right. It's just that in general, one would expect like you'd either have to make a lot of concessions to a public venue or else like hold it at a very weird venue.
Right. Yeah. Like before a punk show in somebody's basement or something.
Exactly. But like, yeah, I found myself really enjoying doing that one. And like the ones that came after it, some of them were like purely cathartic. Some of them were like purely like vent art. Like the bracketing, like set of images was entirely vent art based on the death of a friend. And like, a lot of it was just like really intense, like internally emotional stuff that I would have normally just like scribbled out a little poem about and like stuffed in a locker and forgotten about. And I found like exploring stuff like that in the space of like writing was interesting and cathartic to me.
That's yeah. I was sort of kind of getting that too. I guess I make no bones about the fact that I'm very new to reading contemporary trans authors, and already the sort of width of styles covered is I won't say surprising. It's not surprising, but it's interesting to me, right? Like the amount of ways that I guess similar experiences are covered. Is interesting to me.
There tend to be like a set of like common themes and images and like experiences, certainly, but the way people experience them is as radically different as you can get. Like I think there's a broad spectrum from like just thinking of like friends and colleagues of mine, just like from extremely like about it experimental stuff on one end, like Ava Hoffman, who I've incredibly enjoyed lately, to I mean, obviously, like my friend Jackie, just was this very like light novelistic kind of calling it fluff would be completely wrong, but like stuff that's like really breezy and readable and accessible to like everybody who comes up to it, like people who have never like had any kind of like difficult queer relationship could come to something like Daryl and like come away having learned something. And like there's other things that are like obviously the product of like decades of reading in queer literature and like require that kind of like require or at least reward that kind of breadth of reading before approaching them. Like a lot of the more experimental writers that I'm friends with, like I love their stuff, but also it's like it would be so challenging to recommend it to like an audience that had not read like a lot of trans literature because like they wouldn't know half of what they're going for. Like my friend Never North, their latest project is very like it like the ways it intersects with like trans literature are kind of hard to explain to somebody who hasn't read enough of it. And on its surface level, it has almost like a nursery story kind of vibe. And it's something much more complex than that. And I don't know, like I'm just like I'm in love with the field. Like I completely am. And like I've seen so much cool shit in it, and like I'm always looking forward to seeing more. And like every other like month, I'd say I encounter somebody's work who like is legitimately different from anything I've seen before.
Yeah, and I think we're really lucky to have that.
Sam,
I will say that I've had quite a long discussion with Jackie. I think mostly off the air about like what trans literature is. As a cis person, like trying to like point at something and say, yeah, that's trans literature is hard. Especially since the first time I really ever encountered it was with Sea Witch, and one of the first things Never said when I did the interview was I wanted to write a trans book that isn't really a trans book, and I was like, oh no. I'm like and not sure,
that is the thing. Like, and like I think we all have this idea of like a trans narrative in our heads, and like it ranges from anything to the tawdry and pornographic to like stuff that's entirely for the cis gays. And like the idea that like I think we have this thing we avoid is like the idea of something straightforward and explicable and like something you boil down into a couple of sentences. Like it doesn't appeal to us all that much, and the ways in which we flee from it, like we flee in a million directions, is what it comes down to. And like I think at a certain point you get tired of fleeing and start like writing stuff that's more straightforwardly about gender and about like transness. But like there's a definite period of like a good, I mean for some people decades, where they just don't write anything like that's directly to do with being trans, or is like, or in which that's only a theme rather than like the predominant like overarching like structure of the work. And like for some people it's not a phase. For some people they never write about gender like in that way. For some people like it goes from like your first year it's gender, then like after that it's like exploring different ways that this experience informs you, and then back to maybe gender. Like it seems like something that's different for everybody. And like I don't know, like I just I guess that's just gotten me thinking about like Sea Witch in particular was fantastic, having seen it up close and like I kind of like it interests me that Never's perspective on it is that they wanted to write like something that wasn't a trans novel because that makes complete sense, but also like that's you'd be very surprised to hear that based on the way it's been received.
Mm-hmm.
It 0% surprises me to hear that out of Never, of course, but like it's like I think to like observe it as a phenomenon, you'd assume like, oh, having never read it, you'd assume, oh, this is just very much a trans novel, and it's like it's something very much different than that.
Yeah, I suppose I don't know. How would you even define trans novel, or is it possible? Is it I know it when I see it, or
It's definitely an I know it when I see it thing because like my gut answer to that was going to be, well, it's a novel written by a trans person, but that obviously doesn't work because like I know there are very like novelistic writing kind of trans people who aren't particularly interested in trans people as subjects, and I know that there are people who write. I've known of examples of like competently written trans narratives by cis authors. It's rare, but it does happen, and
mm-hmm.
it's much rarer than like the attempt, which I think should say something. But like, uh, yeah, I think in general, like you could best define something as a trans work if it. No, that's a poser, isn't it? I suppose if it treats trans themes, but then what are those?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you narrowly define that? Like, you can define it as like gender transition or whatever, or social dislocation, or a million other things. Because like, for one, it's not like there's a uniform trans experience. Like, uh, the life that say I don't know, Caitlyn Jenner has lived is a world different from what I've lived, and a world different from what Jackie or Never has lived, and all of us, in our own ways, are like not quite that different from each other, but still worlds apart. And like it's one of those things where like even an individual person can contain multitudes, and like certainly a crowd of people like that, of people defined by their relationship to assigned gender or whatever, are going to be explosively diverse in their perspectives and their experiences.
Right. Yeah. It's yeah, I don't know. I think when Jackie and I talked about it, we almost kind of came to the conclusion within ourselves that it was like maybe not super useful to try to from the outside attack it, right? Like
Exactly. And it's like it's one of those things where like it definitely is useful as a marketing category.
mm-hmm.
And that's one of the ways in which it's become like kind of calcified in use is like, does this novel appeal to trans people? Does it speak to the trans experience in some way? Does it involve trans characters? You wind up getting a set of like marketing bullet points on a work that can characterize it as trans or not trans in that way. And that's something that I think has legs right now, but I don't know how long that'll last.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like a very cyclical thing where like it seems likely that in 5 years the market will be kind of saturated on the next trans novel, and then in another 5 it might be very interested in more. Like certainly the moment we're in now, where there's a lot of genuinely fantastic novels by trans authors coming out in like big presses, is like not unprecedented, but like it's also not necessarily going to last forever, like. And it's not as though any of those people are going to wander in the woods. It's just I don't expect the cultural ladder on the trans novel to remain down forever.
Mm.
I don't think it's going to be like at arm's reach for everybody forever. And like, I think in a way that's not a terrible thing, because as much as I love many of the people I'm talking about here, like I'd completely despair if like everything every trans person wrote looked exactly like that forever.
Right.
But something enduring as a marketing category tends to produce.
Right. Yeah, it seems dangerous to genreify, writing
Absolutely.
by trans people.
Oh, absolutely.
Definitely self-limiting. Was it you who was tweeting the other day about genre?
It was, and like
Yeah.
I'm not. I think it was one of those like almost shower thoughts kind of things where like I don't know if I could back it up, like, but I could certainly just restate it. That like I think that a lot of entertainment right now is kind of ambivalent on the idea of genre and ambivalent on the idea of like marketing by genre, where there are other tools for them to market by, like shared themes, shared moods, their shared images. Those are pretty easy to categorize and pretty easy to like sort people based on. Whereas genre is more of a living tradition of like, peers and readers and you know, customs and traditions within a genre. Like, uh, I'm more interested in like micro genre,
Mm-hmm.
now that I think about it, than about like either deconstructing genre as a whole or like trying to cleave to the traditional model. Like, I'm interested in like the micro genre of like, I'm a bit of a collector of them. Like, there was this micro genre called wing fiction or wing fic for a while in fan fiction communities, which was most rooted in Star Trek, but also involved other shows. It was like gay fan fiction that involved one of the characters sprouting beautiful wings and being ashamed of themselves, and the other one comforting them. It's like it's the strangest thing. It was like explosively popular in the '70s, and then like kind of fell off over the years. And there's other like little micro genres unified by themes. Like I've read at least four like science fiction stories about like uh, somebody being afraid of gridiron football becoming America's national pastime, and writing about, oh God, what if this actually happens? Is America going to become hopelessly violent and insane? And rollerball is probably the best example of that micro genre. And like, I think if you cleave these genres into tiny little like slices of genre, and look at like people who are inspired by each other's works and writing similar things and like getting them closer and closer to cultural visibility, you wind up with like interesting little stories that don't necessarily go anywhere, but like are neat to think about. And like one of the micro genres I'm particularly drawn to lately is the micro genre of like militaria, kind of like a, I don't know exactly how to describe it, like hyper violent writing by like trans people about like either about transness or involving trans characters, with like military, like kind of like hyper warfare oriented settings, like a lot of the stuff on Surfaces that I've been most recent, like
Mm-hmm.
Surfaces literary magazine online, that I've been most recently interested in, has been like in that general vein. And the the public face of it, the essentially the person who runs most of the show, Mika, is like a master of that. And like it's obviously something that's like, if you would ask any of us, we'd probably say with like, oh, we started writing this way because of X author. And like
Mm-hmm.
if you trace it back far enough, I think the origin point of that is probably Porpentine's Living Fucking Creatures,
Mm.
which is fantastic. I should link you to it. But yeah, I find it very enthusiastic about forming these little connections and like seeing what I can learn from them rather than trying to categorize things like seriously in a kind of like marketing oriented kind of way, you know?
Right. I haven't really thought about that type of phenomenon via literature, but I'm very interested in it when it comes to music, especially electronic music, right? Like
Oh, God, yeah, there's
the
so much of it in electronic music, and I love it for that.
the electron or the evolution between like gabber and like terrorcore, and like each little segment, and just like what it takes to become, you know, like where is the line, the razor thin line between gabber and hardstyle. And like sometimes it's time, and sometimes it's tempo, and sometimes it's just like the samples that they use. Like, oh well, you can't use samples from animated television shows because then it's no longer whatever. Like it has to be 80s action movies. Like if you use an animated television show, it's something completely different.
Right.
And I love that. I think people get, I interact with people, and always have, who get kind of like bugged by it, right? Even like musicians, like, oh man, we don't make funk metal, we just make music. And it's like, okay, yeah, but like so does Eminem, right? And like
Exactly.
Eminem
There's
and
so many people music, and like they all are making different kinds of music, and clearly you're making different kinds than other people.
right. Yeah, I can't be like, oh man, you like Primus? I also like music. You should listen to Bone Thugs and Harmony.
God.
I mean, it's possible to like both, but it's a ridiculous sort of thing.
Exactly.
but I mean, also that same sort of thing, like, you know, I can't tell you how many television shows I've been recommended because I like Twin Peaks that are like nothing like that. Like whatever micro genre you could call Twin Peaks, like I haven't seen anything that I would recommend to somebody because they like Twin Peaks, you know?
Oh God, yeah, same. I think like in that respect, there's some artists who are just kind of sui generis. Like David Lynch is a great example of that in cinema and television. Like a lot of people do stuff like inspired by him, but it's always their own thing. Like nobody can exactly imitate his formula, and like anybody who tries usually fails. Like the most interesting people I've seen in the context of Lynch are like people like Ikehara, who loves Lynch and likes like pastiching him and likes adapting things from his work into like his own like series. But like even that is like very, you'd have to be very into like certain kinds of anime to actually appreciate like, you know, what he's doing with Lynchian kind of motifs and like say Utena or Penguin Drum or whatever. Like it's one of those things where like there's definitely artists out there who are just kind of doing their own thing and are hard to categorize.
Right. Which I think makes the sort of anti-genre crowd, like, it's good fodder for them, right? Because you can be like, well, what would you call Lynch? It's like, well, I guess I'd call him Lynchian.
Exactly.
But that's
He's his own
it,
thing.
you know, and yeah, that's true, you know, like he is a genre of himself, you know, that, but kind of speaking of that, I noticed, getting back to your own writing, I noticed in Fuck Shit there was, like Strict Machine, and there was another one that was sort of like very science fiction oriented. That like I think Strict Machine is also maybe one of my favorite pieces in it, because of the world building in it, and this idea of I don't know, a sort of queer cyberpunk sort of thing where it wasn't in Strict Machine, but it was in another one of the ones that used the mulcher term.
Oh yeah, like I like those little touches that build towards shared universes, like When's Ansible, like the idea that like there's shared mechanics even if they're not like shared timelines or whatever, and like one of them is like this big idea that's been floating in my head forever that will probably turn into something bigger at some point, of just like a post-scarcity future sort of inspired by but in direct opposition to Ian Banks' Culture series, where what you're doing is like taking a humanity and trying to make everything in the world out of like living beings, out of, you know, essentially out of meat, out of human meat. And you know, the idea that you could just have a job for a while as like a human like organ factory, or a living womb the size of a city, or a door, or whatever, like, and these can be valid occupations you can have, and then like have your body mulched and then reborn as something else. Like it's just something that like there's a few touches like that that are like consistent throughout like little stories I write, and like one of these days I'd really like to put together like a sort of like semi-serious like timeline tree of like my different works that are just exploring which of them share different like events, which of them share like different technologies, which of them share, et cetera, and like just exploring the ways in which characters and events are similar across the boundaries of the story. As far as Strict Machine goes, that one kind of came to me in the car, as some of the best ones do, and like I loved writing it, and like I loved just the tone of it, the idea of this kind of like almost like, I mean, I want to say savage love, even though I hate savage love, but like that tier of letter directed at like an advice columnist from like this person who got assassinated, but it wasn't a big deal. Like I love that, and like I loved writing it, and I want to like return to that like whole universe, because like there were a couple of things in Fuck Shit I think that both worked with that, and I want to go back there. I always want to go back there. Like some of my tweets are even about that. Like it's fascinating to me, the idea of creating this like Cronenbergian like disgusting universe in which people are happy, and that's something that like a friend of mine has pointed out like is a recurring thing of my work, is like I like constructing worlds that are repellent and plots that are repellent and events that are repellent and even people that are repellent, and have people who, for whatever reason, are completely content with the way things are. Like, that's one of the things I come back to again and again is like, I it's not necessarily how I explore the world myself. Like, I don't like the idea of, responding to, fascism, climate change, the various horrible things America is doing to people all over the world and domestically all the time. And I don't like responding to that with like just glib acceptance. But also, I know there's a part of me that tries to.
Mm.
I think the writing is a way of exploring that. Like, what part of me is trying to respond to this by just saying, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, so as you're talking, I think about like the Cenobites, right? Like their whole thing is just there's no longer a difference between pleasure and pain, and just like I just need extreme experience, and that's how I enjoy myself. And I can kind of see a post late stage capitalism where, just everybody's pumped full of whatever they need to be pumped full of to sort of not worry about what's going on. And yeah, it's just the idea that like, walking down the street and the person next to you can be vaporized, and it's just like, it's Tuesday. You know, like,
and another one of my stories, in fact, like, there's this discussion of like something called mosquito mange, which I borrowed from Star Control, which borrowed itself from Roadside Picnic ultimately. But like the way it was implemented there was like some manner of like experimentation with like space time or whatever resulted in just pockets that would crush parts of your body and horribly kill you, and it being all over the news, kind of being the part of the analog of COVID that was going on at the time. Still is, obviously. But like just this kind of glibness towards like seeing people walking their dogs without any kind of like protection from this horrible like space-time force, and like just the idea there's a very slim chance that like that would just turn the dog inside out or turn the person inside out, and like just responding to that with like horror but also like indifference. And like the horror and indifference and like is one thing I like treating, and so is like active enjoyment of hellish things. Like the perverse inclination to like be in hell and say this is good actually.
Right. Yeah. I feel like I've seen the meme of somebody being like beaten by a cop and just screaming harder daddy, like like what are you gonna do? Like at this point, you have found yourself in a situation that like the only way to get through it is to pretend that it's an enjoyable experience, which
God knows that happens.
A funny thing that happened when I was reading that Strict Machine, and then Studies After a Landscape, I think is the other one I was really into, is I was looking in Bait. One of the characters is wearing a gaff, which is something I'd never heard of before. So I Googled it and I realized what it was. And I said, oh, okay, that's cool. But then anytime I came across a term in fuck shit that I did not recognize, I Googled it. But because some of them are made up, I just ended up Googling like and coming up with weird things like wet dom, which in the context of the world like makes sense. But I was like, I don't know, that could be a kink thing I'm not aware of. Like maybe it's... I don't know, and came up with a whole bunch of nothing funny, but then, the idea of mulching, and I was like, okay, so maybe that's something. So I was like typing in mulching and just coming up with a bunch of landscaping stuff, and then I was like, well, it seems like it's related to death. What if I type mulching death? And then I was just, that's very unfortunate to Google mulching death and then, not be expecting some anything other than some kink thing to show up. It just was a whole bunch of gore pictures. So I found that very funny that I like naively walked myself into seeing terrible images on the internet for the first time since like 2006.
Oh gosh, I'm genuinely sorry about that. Like I think like the actual point of reference I have for mulching like internally it is something like the recycling tanks in Alpha Centauri, if you've ever played that. Like there's a little quote in every technology in that game, and one of them for the one for recycling tanks is something to the effect of, it is every citizen's final duty to go into the tanks and become one with all the people. And it's a very early game quote that's kind of establishing one of the factions is this kind of like totalitarian hellscape. And the idea being that, like in many of the factions, the recycling tanks are just used to break things down into their, component materials. And in this faction, it's also used on human bodies. And in this case, the mulching case is like you're taking the consciousness out of the body, shunting it out in some way, and then turning the body to useful materials. Because at that point, you're done with it. And like a dead body is like essentially like the idea of mulching is like that it's like a colloquialism for something that would probably have a more formal term in any of these universes. But it's consistently used like mulching, and also the idea of a mulcher being a job which involves mulching.
I like that a lot. One of the things, I guess I can't think of a good example of somewhere else in literature that I'd come up with it, but I like the idea, and I feel like I've come across it before, of somebody just like picking a word and making it a job. And I wish I could think of an example. But it kind of makes me think of like how I view television writing, where like especially Twin Peaks, like season 2, where I feel like somebody just had an idea and then had to retrofit the idea into the series to make sense. But I like that idea that you can kind of take something very ordinary. A kind of bad example, I guess, or maybe a cult one is Coheed and Cambria, the band. Because they're a concept band, and because they're writing a story based on song lyrics and or song lyrics based on a band, is you have things that just like, there's a song lyric that says "man your jackhammers," which in the context of the universe of the Coheed and Cambria story is just a type of battleship, but in a song from 2003 that fits in the sort of emo framework, it's just a very strange line of song. And that's just an aesthetic that I like. Like, I don't know. It's a weird tangent, and I don't know if I'm articulating myself very good. And so I'm like also racking my brain to try to think of like an example to make up to better illustrate it, and I can't do it.
I think there's just a general like, it's one of those things where like I definitely get what you mean, where like, and I also think in some forms of art, like in writing, for example, in science fiction, it's completely accepted that you'll like take a common everyday word and just use it to mean something else, or like invent an entirely new word to refer to something you have to refer to in the story. So much so there's been like old gimmick stories based on that, like and memes, formed around that from the fandom culture. But I think like there's less license to do it in music, and like the only case I can think of like. I think other than like, I'm not that terribly familiar with a lot of musicians who have successfully like had their own jargon that turned into like something respectable in mainstream culture. I think like the only examples I can think of are like George Clinton and to a degree Sun Ra.
Sure, yeah. I suppose I guess it's not easy to do that in funk, but it's you can expect to find it a lot in funk.
Yeah, like just basically a vocabulary of personal invention is accepted in some areas and completely not in others. And like one of the fortunate things about science fiction is like, as somebody who does speculative fiction primarily, like I have complete license to just go on like little world building tangents and like to come up with words that mean things I want them to, and only what I want them to in the context of the story, and just expect everybody to be on my level. And like it's funny because like a lot of the more literary people that are close to me, they have nowhere near that license to do that. And like it's definitely interesting to look at like how differently they write because of that, because like if somebody isn't on the same page with you in more literary writing rather than more genre writing, like that's usually your problem. If that happens occasionally in like more genre writing like speculative fiction, that's completely the reader's problem, and that fascinates me. I think that's one of the things I really enjoyed about Sea Witch,
is that it starts off with a cast list, but also like therefore a cosmology that allows for people to be living within people and also next to people, a very sort of like panentheistic sort of way of existing that at the time I described as cozy, and I still think of it as cozy. But I think that's that cozy word. I think I have a bad definition for it, or maybe like a broken definition for it, because I feel like Strict Machine and Studies After a Landscape like also hit that for me. Like
I could see that, honestly. Like, there are definitely worlds in which like what we're witnessing is kind of some of the worst that happens to people.
yeah.
And I could see a value in that. Like, in particular, like I think they both also come from the idea, like the idea of this universe of like just living flesh everywhere is something I find oddly comforting, and like couldn't tell you exactly why. Like, it's a way of like exploring like the kind of like, you know, the Star Trek utopianism of my childhood through a lens of like adulthood, while still holding on to the idea that something more than the world we're living in is possible.
Yeah.
And like, I don't know, I like that. I like the idea of like the possibility of like not just containing but embodying multitudes, you know?
Yeah. Temperature strikes me as we're working through it. Like if everything is made of flesh, right? Everything's like 98 degrees the whole time. Like everything's just kind of like you no longer are worrying about climate because everything is just flesh. Everything is flesh temperatured.
Yeah, yeah, and also like presumably if you need cold flesh, you can get it colder. If you need hot flesh, you can get it hotter. It's biology is miraculous that way.
Another thing I noticed, I suppose it would be impossible not to, is all of the quotes before stories and fuck shit, and
those I had so much fun with. There's a couple of them that are lyrics or genuine quotes, and most of them are just invented.
oh, okay. Well then that's good, because I was like, aside from Rush, I'm pretty sure I don't know any of this. Like,
Let me have a quick look and fuck shit real quick, because I could tell you which of these are actual quotes, mostly from song lyrics, honestly, and which of these are just straight up made up. So just having a quick look here. Okay. Yeah, the Sperber one is that's Klaus Nomi. The one for Beta is fictional. The one for the American Medical Association is fictional as well, and also my favorite in the whole thing. Any who denies the finality of his own castration in his heart is not yet a eunuch and must be governed with an iron hand. I fucking loved writing that.
yeah,
And Rush is a musician. I think a songwriter as well. I think somebody else is best known for covering that song, but like, yeah, it's just a songwriter from long ago. Belfour is a fictional person, as is Tedesco. And yeah, like I think most of these are fictional. And I just had the idea of making up like little fictional epigraphs for each little story. And I just rolled with that for that particular one. And like, I don't think I'll do it again, because I think over the course of like, you know, a collection of like 50 stories, I think incredibly obnoxious.
right.
But like, it was fun for that little one though.
I can't remember who I was thinking or who I was talking to about epigraphs and how I generally just sort of skim them. Like, I don't really give them the weight that I feel like they're supposed to have. Maybe it was Ava.
I think skimming them is honestly appropriate.
Why's that?
Well, because like, as weightily as they might be intended. Oh, I've got a kitten. As weightily as they might be intended, they're kind of intended as more of a mood-setting device. And if they're executed well, they don't need to hold a lot of weight. They just need to strike an opening sort of note and then like linger in the air for a little while and then be gone. the idea that you'd have to like have an entire story resting on an epigraph is very I can't see that working for anybody writing that way.
Sure. Well, because it bets a lot on the reader understanding the outside context, right?
Oh, absolutely. Also, like, I completely apologize if it turns out that the word I'm looking for is epigram, and I've been leading us both to talk about epigrams this whole time. I can never remember which is which.
That's why I said quote.
Clever.
Yeah, that's what you get when you charisma your way through high school and don't learn very much.
Same.
Yeah, now I'm really stuck on the American Medical Association one. It feels so real. It feels like I could very easily grab that out of some weird, like Middle Ages, like Gnostic remnant that's like hanging around in the 1300s or something.
I wound up like like building exactly enough of a character for this like fictional quote author to like pin that on. And I think that's actually exactly like more or less exactly correct. The idea that he was like some kind of medieval Byzantine authority on something or other, and just trying to write about this like this is like both a literal and metaphorical statement.
Yeah.
Like both like trying to talk about how one manages eunuchs and also how one manages people in general, something like that. Like, and it's one of those things where like it would be very difficult to find something that struck the exact mood I wanted, but very easy to just write fucking whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like it's definitely a dangerous power, and I don't expect to like do a lot of false epigraphs in the future, but like it was very fun when I did it.
I think it's a good skill to have. I think that and the art of writing a good blurb are two similar and just good talents to have. Like, not super applicable outside of very specific situations, I suppose, but
Mm-hmm.
as much as I'm at times baffled and bewildered by a very obtuse blurb, I'm also fascinated by them.
Oh yeah, I know of several people who've apparently had the practice of like having essentially a form blurb for everyone they blurb, like just sending in the same thing, and anyone ever notices, and I don't think anybody ever does.
That's good.
And there's also like I've known of a couple of cases of people being asked to blurb, like friends of mine being asked to blurb things that by people they don't know and books they don't really care to read, and that's always a little awkward.
Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, like it's one of those things where like some of the people I know like very much value their privacy, and the idea of being hit up by a random person to blurb a work of theirs, like not to discourage this as a practice at all. Like I think the idea of like asking someone to blurb your book is like fine, but like certain people certainly do not like it, and it's just a very strange like spectrum of opinions, where some people I know have been asked to blurb things so often they've kind of gotten bored of it, and some people have been asked to blurb things and not wanted to so often they've just kind of taken up a blank policy and not doing it at all. I don't know how I'd approach it myself. I've never been asked to blurb a book.
I've been asked one time. I told him I would do it, and it's been like 3 years. So I don't think I'm going to. And I had no idea. It was very early on in my doing this show, so I was still like getting used to non-professorial people reading my writing at all, and getting used to the idea that people were taking my opinions seriously enough to want them printed on a book. It was much for me at that time.
Yeah, I can imagine. Like I think even at this stage of my life, when I've been doing this for years, I'd still have a bit of trepidation of being asked to blurb something, I think.
To sort of take a right hook from here, I found the choice to have a whole bunch of your stuff hosted on itch.io to be interesting.
I'd love to talk about that, actually. Yeah, like A lot of my approach to it has been like I started out putting things up on Gumroad, primarily collections of glitch poetry, and I swerved on Gumroad, and I'm not entirely sure why. Something to do with their adult content policies rubbed me the wrong way, I think.
Hmm.
But in particular, my approach to like publishing almost exclusively like self-pub via digital distribution is like it's something that's inspired by friends of mine who do similar things. Who will like I don't know if anybody like off the top of my head like other than say Porpentine, and like she's always like 10 steps ahead of everybody else in these things. But I don't know of anybody who's routinely put out like compilations of short stories on digital distribution. And I know it happens. I know people put out individual short stories in digital distribution and like put them out like for a small fee. And like I don't want to say that I've invented this because I know other people are doing it, but like I noticed at the time, say Sporozine came out, that this was a viable digital platform for releasing, short fiction. And I had just enough chops to put together PDFs, and I figured I can just put together like PDFs of my different stories and like start like putting them up, pay what you want. And like the idea of like also on a certain level, the idea of like having a set price for my works actually has always sat a little ill with me, because I don't love the idea of like I grew up in a household that was constantly like, pirating movies, like dubbing tapes from Blockbuster and that kind of thing.
Wow.
Getting like pirated VHSs from family members, and like there was an ethos in the house that I grew up in that like wasn't necessarily like, oh, we don't have to pay for things. It's like we can't pay for things, but we still have a right to have access to culture. I've had this general mentality ever since I was young that like I think there's a positive right to access to culture, and I think even at the point, like obviously don't tell anybody who ever publishes me this, but like even at the point at which like if I'm ever like publishing anything in print, which necessarily implies like investment of capital and therefore a price point, I wouldn't be mad if somebody stole my work or pirated it even. Like it's just one of those things where like I feel like it's part of the price of doing business, and B, like I want people to read what I'm doing, and I feel like people have more of a right to read what I'm putting out there, read the range of things that are being put out there by people like me, than I do to collect 50 cents on that. And certainly like having this like upfront and saying upfront like you can pay what you want is kind of a best of both worlds situation, because some people do want to pay for what they're reading and they want to like support what I'm doing, and I always appreciate that. But I also don't want to say to somebody like, you want to read my collection of short stories, give me your last $4.
Yeah.
Like it's a nightmare to me. Like I like the idea of people paying what they can, and if they can't or don't want to pay for it, just downloading it and going on with their lives.
Yeah. Well, cool. I like that. I was not aware that you could just upload PDFs to that platform, which is cool.
I wasn't until a couple of years ago, honestly. Like I genuinely thought of it as primarily games distribution like platform, and I suppose it still is. But like, I've seen so much cool work go up on itch.io in the last like couple of years, and it's not something I was exactly on the ground floor of, but like it's something I was pretty early on, and like people have increasingly been using it as a digital distribution platform, and I love it for that. I love like everything I've seen out of like trans artists on that like weird little website.
Yeah, look at that book category. Look at all those books. So I will say, and yeah, for whatever reason, self-publishing at all, anything beyond like posting some poems or a very short piece on like neutral spaces, I'm so self-conscious about like editing, I guess. Like for as much as there is that is problematic about the gatekeeper, like I'd like to have that separation between me and the reader, that it was like, but that person said it was okay to come out. Like that person said we're done. Like I need somebody to look at it and be like, yes, they are ready.
I think like definitely self-pub world loses out on a little bit by like the the low stakes nature of it means that hiring an editor independently would be unrealistic, and the absence of any such figure at all is not necessarily positive. Like uh, if I was like say to if I was to offer somebody going rates to edit something, I'd lose money for one.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing is like if I didn't like what they say, I could tell them to go pound sand. I think a lot of people have this very adversarial relationship to editing that isn't necessarily merited. At least if it doesn't involve like some kind of institutional access, which often editing is wrapped up in.
Mm-hmm.
I've loved the stuff I've done with like various people as editors, and I view it more as a form of like artistic collaboration, trying to create the best work I can out of the raw material of what I've done. And like, I hate the layers of institutional access that go along with that. I hate how frequently, like, in order to get a second professional eye on what you're doing and a close read on what you're doing to correct little mistakes and so on, you're functionally dealing with somebody who like cuts you a check.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I think a lot about capitalism leaves like the world of literature and art extremely disordered.
Right. Yeah. I think of the line from the Ed Harris Jackson Pollock movie where they ask him, "How do you know when a painting's done?" And he's like, "How do you know when you're done having sex?" Which also, like, as a cis man, like, I know when I'm finished. Thank you very much. There's really no question there. But it's much more of an open-ended question, right? It's just like when I'm satisfied with it. And obviously,
Exactly.
if I become unsatisfied, then I scrap it. But like, I don't know. And just like I was reading an indie book recently, a physical indie book that had at least one typo in it. And so I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
so what are we doing then? Like, why are we putting these on paper? Like, I know it's easy to miss that. And my wife reads novels all the time that come out from imprints of Big Fives, and she's like, there's a typo. And she's got an English degree and went for, with the idea of being an editor. So maybe I'm also answering my own question here, but, you know, it's just, I guess it's just part of the larger question of like, what do we as, this anti-capitalist future of literature do with the medium?
Right. Like it's hard to imagine how things will shake out, but also like as far as like as far as typos go, as far as like the base like the very grunt work of editing goes, uh I find that like a lot of I'm very sorry, I'm being distracted by a kitten trying to cuddle me. But like a lot of people working in the indies these days are like functionally one step removed from what they used to call a vanity press.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're sending a book in to be published, and the work of the publication is primarily just setting the book and like then printing it and sending you copies to sell it a markup. And the whole proposition of that used to exist of like trying to shape this book into something marketable, to shape it into something that endures, that sells, is no longer really in the cards for a lot of people in the indies. And like a lot of like the pulp model has fundamentally changed from one that is like grind out pulp and get it published on the cheap to grind out pulp and publish it yourself, basically, or at least sell it yourself. Like if whether or not you publish it yourself, like
Right.
I know a lot of the profits for a lot of the trans indie darlings lately have been, well, primarily as a result of self-distribution rather than like anything the publisher does. Like there are exceptions, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
especially recently, but like a lot of the basically everything that got big before like 2018 or so, I'd say probably made as much money for the author through things that weren't a sales contract as were through them.
Right. Yeah. I have, I guess, a complicated set of feelings about it too, because like, on the one hand, um, the vanity press thing is a pretty valid criticism, but also like, you know, some of my favorite books of all time have come out through presses that you could call, one step removed from a vanity press. So like,
completely no shade to vanity presses
right.
at this point in history. Like the pejorative element to it is definitely kind of a holdover from a previous period of literature.
Sure.
I genuinely don't think there's any shame in like even the idea of paying to have your book published and then try to sell it yourself. Like that is so common these days that I think the stigma behind it has almost vanished.
Sure. Yeah, the thing I guess I wish I would see more from some indie presses, and I'm not even thinking of any specifically that I'm not saying, like just in general, is more of a desire to try to sell copies. Mm-hmm. Which sounds obvious, but like I feel like you as a publisher, and like right now on my Patreon is a list, or is a subscriber goal for me starting Writing the Rapids, the small press. So like I'm thinking about this where your money is where my mouth is, but like
right.
Like I feel like you have a responsibility at that point. Like, yes, I know that even people who get published through Big Fives like have in their contracts, like you have to have a Twitter account so you can tweet about your book. Like you marketing your work is part of the deal.
That's awful.
But also, like that's the only reason after Lindsay Ellis got in a whole bunch of trouble about Raya and the Last Dragon that she kept her Twitter account open. It's like, I literally have to have a Twitter account so I can tweet about my book, or my contract is void.
What a nightmare! Like the idea that they wouldn't even do that for you,
right?
They wouldn't even like maintain a presence for you online so people see your books. You have to do that yourself. Is just, they have to have the money for it. It just seems like skinflint shit.
Right, and I agree. But however, I can at least walk into a Barnes and Noble and find a Lindsay Ellis book.
True.
And I don't know what it takes. I don't know, like maybe distribution is the blockage, between walking into my local bookstore and buying something by some of my friends and not. So like maybe that's where we need new something. Maybe we don't need more indie presses. Maybe we need more indie distribution. But I suppose I don't know.
I wish I did. Like, I wish I was more well-versed on that kind of thing, because, like, the subject kind of fascinates me, and, like, the general evolution of, like, American publishing from, like, a sort of pyramidal structure of, like, authors that are highly compensated on top and authors, grinding out a pauper's wage on the bottom, like, has transitioned to this completely, like, detached apex where, like, certain people are kind of IP factories and everybody else is, like, basically working for exposure,
right?
Or only slightly better than exposure. Like, I think a lot of the most exciting people in literature right now functionally have to have other jobs, and like this extends like way farther up the food chain than I think people imagine. Like everybody that I've talked about, I think either has a different job or like has financial support like from outside of their living situation. Like, I think I don't know, like, if there's anybody out there like actually just supporting themselves entirely on their writing or on their Patreon from their writing in the trans community that I know of. Like, there might be people out there who are, but like there's very few of them, and yet we have like thousands of authors that are world class authors. Like, it's certainly not a defect of skill that causes this, and it's not a defect of marketability. It's just a defect of like distribution of resources, I think.
Yeah, a defect of desire of the people who could do it, right?
Exactly. Gosh, this cat has been all over me for the last 10 minutes. I'm so sorry.
It is delightful to watch you wrestle with the cat. I wish we had a video component, but we do not, and everybody else just has to deal with the theater of the mind of you having a cat crawling all over you as you're making very intelligent statements.
For the benefit of the audience at home, her name is Maya, and she's a black cat, and she's very fluffy.
She's very fluffy. Yes, I can confirm. to that point, I suppose another thing that keeps me personally from doing a lot of digital stuff that isn't just like one-off stories or whatever is just like I I'm old-fashioned in that I feel like if possible a book should be read on paper. And
I feel that. I know there are a lot of people like that, and I eventually do want to like start doing zine-ish kind of stuff, so like that's more feasible for people. But like I'd love to get stuff into print like through a vanity press at some point. But also like I genuinely think like there's high bars to entry for like even getting shit on paper, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
There's certain inherent like investments of capital that are involved that make like, say, just printing out a run of a story and giving it away, it makes it a loss leader at best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like I looked into like, say, zine printing for the story that I might be reading later, and it'd be on the order of like $60 for 100 copies, and like that's not terrible, but like it's also not something I could reasonably just do to give away 100 copies of it, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially if you're shipping any of it anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because then that's multiplied by like $4 or whatever a package, depending on weight, I guess. I guess if it's scenes, it's probably cheaper, but I couldn't tell you. But that doesn't count the packaging, which isn't expensive but isn't free. So yeah,
exactly.
Like it is hard to, even for the small presses that do work to make sure people buy books and put out good products and have quality editing teams and stuff like that. Like it is a challenge to make a profit off of a book,
Mm-hmm.
So it's tough.
Tough stuff all around.
Right. Why did we choose to do this with our lives? This seems like a bad idea.
God only knows. I feel like if I could do anything else, I would.
Yeah.
I feel like if I had any other form of art in me, I'd do that instead. And if I could work a 9 to 5 easily, I probably would. But like yeah, like, and part of it is also that like genuinely I think there's something older and in a way more important than the capitalist drive to make money, to make a living, to support yourself with your own two hands. There's this nobility to the pursuit of art that I hopelessly believe in, even in the face of like seeing how corruptible art is. I genuinely believe that people have been making culture, for lack of a better word, making art, making music, poetry, which was originally part of music, stories, which were originally set to music, like entertainment and enrichment and ennoblement for one's fellow human being has been part of how people interact with the world and get by in the world and live as human beings since time out of mind in every culture we know of. Like in every culture we know of, there are storytellers and there are stories. And it feels a little bit, conceited to say that's the tradition I work in, because obviously, I come from a house like anybody else. But I think that's what I aspire to, rather than, trying to support myself, trying to make money, trying to scramble for, number one bestseller or whatever. I want to tell stories, and I want to make nights like these, the dead of winter, or, the dead of fall or whatever. I want to make them less cold and lonely, as people have been doing since time out of mind. That's a lot of what I'm doing. The story I'm going to read for you now is God Chose Violence in Every Part of His Design. It was first published on surfaces.cx about a year and a half ago. And my friends like it a lot, and I'm hoping you will too. All Night Bitch knows how to hate a motherfucker. She learned it whatever she suckled at instead of a titty. Gnashed by huge packs of dog-wolf hybrids every single day in a special boot camp to build up Mithridatic immunity to crushing, piercing, grinding weapons. Her instructor at the boot camp was Wolf Dog Hybrid. She learned their language and mastered their combat style instantly. She has no further use for anything on 4 legs. Her weak points are all covered in the latest armor. Don't worry about it. Prismatic blades ring her major arteries with extra falsy blades for arteries she doesn't need anymore. You better believe her dick is a deadly weapon. Special modifications allow her to bioregenerate sabo and flechette cum, easily capable of defeating up to 5 centimeter thick ceramic plate armor. It gives her confidence, but she can never know a lover's touch. No sweat to Night Bitch. Night Bitch is deployed in the Daytona Flesh Ripping Zone, home of the Daytona Flesh Rippers, home of those living shafts of God's rancid light, home of the ectopresence, home of the Daytona viral sentience. Walmart after Walmart after Walmart, each equipped with 2 fully functional reanimator cenotaphs. She stops for a cigarette and slops fresh flesh onto her bones to replace the parts flying knives or the flesh rippers peeled off. Night Bitch. Tell me about the light, guys. Control? Control. No good. President says we can't torture him. Night Bitch. Fucking pussies. Control. President says it's physically impossible. Says all they feel is pleasure all the time. Night Bitch. Fucking pussies. Time dilation sets in and permanite gets darker. Something is stirring over in Sporting Goods Alpha, deep in Walmart 7. Night Bitch stubs out her cigarette in her bionic tongue. Integrated razors cut the ashes into their component molecules to aid digestion. Night Bitch. Control. I got contact in Sporting Goods Alpha. Control. You're cleared to engage. Night Bitch. Can I knock that sumbitch down? Control. Negative, Night Bitch. You know you gotta leave Sporting Goods alone. Try luring into housewares. Night Bitch. Fuck you. You never let me do anything fun. Control. Please don't tell anyone I made you mad. Tight burst into Sporting Goods Alpha makes the contact book it, but it's booking it the wrong way, deeper into the hunter-killer drone racks. Night Bitch is swearing for real now. She jerks off the bolt knob, releasing a dozen unspent shells from her huge mag. When wild animals existed, this was a behavior the perverts that watched them called stotting. Honest signaling. I can beat off this gun and still kills you, I can beat off this gun and still kill you, Night Bitch is trying to say. Unbelievable alpha move. Turns out it's not a living shaft of God's rancid light at all. One of the big dogs gains sentience outside of business hours. It's clattering around and trying to hump shit. That's always the first thing they do. Then they start trying to save random pieces of trash they find. Night Bitch doesn't care about the big dogs. Just wants to end this bullshit before one starts doing Wall-E shit and makes her look bad. Night Bitch. I got visual in that contact. Fucking bot, man. I'm gonna ice it. Control. You're cleared to take it out with ballistics. Night Bitch. Negative. I'm going in for melee. I want to watch it die. Control. Damn. Okay. Night Bitch sees a look in that dumbass big dog's sensors when it notices her. She has it cornered and she's just cutting it and cutting it and cutting it with her vibro knife. Who knows what it's thinking? Maybe it just doesn't want to die, or maybe it's glad that it was a famous Night Bitch that got it. It learns how to die fast for something that wasn't alive an hour ago. Night Bitch pops this detached pattern recognition flash into her mouth and sucks on it like a hard candy, which hasn't existed for over 1 million years, and that makes what she's doing more normal. The lithium grease hits her bloodstream and gets converted to novel molecules by her kidney nanites. Eyes like pinholes and she's seeing shit. Night Bitch. I think I understand, Control. I think I get what it's all about. Control. Come again, Night Bitch? Night Bitch. Horrible combat whips ass, and I'm the best at it. Control. Acknowledged. Night Bitch engages flight and crashes into the armor-plated drop ceiling of Walmart 7. The blunt impact feels like feathers landing on her back, and her collarbone briefly shatters under the strain, only to knit back together stronger within 2 seconds. With nothing but the force of her iron will and her leg-mounted anti-grav unit operating at high throttle, she plunges through the roof and into the open air. All the lights in the sky are hostile satellites. Stars aren't bright enough to get through the ground light anymore. Night Bitch is glad about that. She's heard about people gazing at the stars and makes her angry. Makes her wonder what they think is so special up there. She shoots a microgrenade into a crumbling bank and worthless money flies into the sky, wreathed by purple arcs of plasma flame. Control. Why'd you shoot that building, Night Bitch? Night Bitch. It seemed like it'd be cool if it exploded. Control. Copy. You're cleared to blow up more shit if you want. Night Bitch. I will if I get bored again, I guess. The sky is crisscrossed with disgusting beams of light, chemtrails for a future without even the hope of thought reform. Among the beams of light but cloaked in darkness is the sums of mankind's hopes. Maxed out stats, biomod to hell and back, awful creature cuckolded by the god of war, waiting out her days in perfect violence after the end of time. The year is 2350-3050. The paving fucked remains of America grown under billions of hell is real billboards. No other cover exists from lethal levels of orbital Sissy Ray bombardment. The latest combat zone is a human asshole. Enter the perfect mercenary, Night Bitch.